Adesso passo la parola all'ultimo intervento di oggi, quello di Antonio Arantes, uno degli ospiti internazionali di questo convegno, direttore di Arte Sol e anche uno dei padri fondatori, direi, della Convenzione UNESCO per la salvaguardia del patrimonio culturale immateriale.
Buonasera a tutti, mi dispiace molto non poter presentare il mio lavoro in italiano, ma io vi parlerò in inglese. Sarebbe meglio parlarvi in portoghese, ma penso che questo sarà troppe lingue. Adesso vi parlo in inglese, ma io ho preparato con l'aiuto da Valentina un PowerPoint in italiano perché le idee siano un po' più chiare. E vorrei per cominciare ringraziare alla Regione Lombardia e al SIMPDEA per questo invito e dire vera che mi sento veramente felice e onorato di essere qui con voi in questo convegno.
Aggiungere, c'è un servizio di interpretazione, di traduzione, quindi se qualcuno volesse prendere delle cuffie potrà sentire l'intervento tradotto in italiano.
Il tema che mi è stato dato è troppo vasto, troppo ampio. Io ho scelto di fare una riflessione su quel soggetto, ma da un punto di vista più allo stesso storico, nel senso che io parlerò della traiettoria del Brasile come uno dei paesi che hanno lavorato per la creazione di una convenzione per la salvaguardia dei beni intangibili e anche di una prospettiva un po' più concettuale, perché ci sono questioni che sono rilevanti a livello internazionale, locale, come abbiamo visto nella presentazione anteriore, ma sono infatti sono inerenti a questi generi di lavoro. Passo all'inglese allora. The formation of preservation institutions and the designing of safeguarding policies respond to local needs, constraints and timing. These may vary from one part of the world to another, and indeed do so very significantly. For that reason, comparative approaches to legal instruments and policies must take into consideration such specific constraints and possibilities, even when referred to the implementation of policies that respond to internationally negotiated parameters such as UNESCO's Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, which is the main reference document in this meeting. However, institutional meetings strongly indicate that we are all contributing for various reasons and in different ways to the formation of a common ICH-related agenda within an emergent global cultural public sphere. This international, perhaps supranational arena is being articulated by a network of academic researchers, activists, NGOs, as well as by public officials, often acting on such occasions as individuals, rather than as institutional representatives. A strong step forward in this direction was given by the first NGO's declaration presented at the 4th Intergovernmental Committee of the Convention's Intergovernmental Committee at Abu Dhabi in 2008. My assignment to this afternoon's meeting is to present a short introduction to safeguarding of traditional knowledge and expressions in Brazil, so as to offer you some comparative food for thought. So let us now move on to it. Okay. Sì? Va bene? Che succede? Sì, va bene? Instituto do Patrimonio Histórico e Artístico Nacional, which is the Brazilian Federal Institute for Artistic and Historic Heritage, hereinafter IFAN, has set the basic parameters for most preservation institutions in the country since its creation in 1937. It was conceived and implemented by a modernist intellectual elite, architects, writers, historians, who are not necessarily in line with nationalist ideologies prevalent within and outside the country in the 1930s. Putting it a short and necessarily crude way, I would say that IFAN's mission for at least 5 decades has been to identify, protect, and promote Brazilian cultural goods of outstanding artistic and historical value, following the general trends set out by the Athens and Venice Heritage Charts and, since 1972, UNESCO's World Heritage Convention. However, our post-colonial condition, strongly articulated with indigenous African and European immigrant cultural repertoires, produced a heterogeneous and tense, if not conflictive, background to the formation of Brazil as a nation. Debates about what would be national culture in Brazil, as well as the ambivalent and ambiguous position of the country's elites vis-à-vis European hegemony in the arts and humanities, particularly up to the first decades of the 20th century, are a constant motto in the field of cultural heritage. In the Whereas for the 1920s and 30s modernist writer, Mário de Andrade, one of the founding fathers of IFAN, cultural heritage is literacy, and to promote historic and artistic heritage is a way of Brazilianizing Brazilians. Oswald de Andrade polemically argues that anthropophagy is the only thing that brings us together, referring to the selectively swallowing and digesting in a Brazilian way the cultural achievements of others. He writes, I am only interested about what does not belong to me. The dominant outcome of these conflicting views about national culture for the construction of a Brazilian heritage has been the celebration of Baroque religious architecture and colonial historical cities, which has been instrumental to the development of a modernist architecture strongly influenced by Le Corbusier, the French modernist architect. The first initiative to protect and promote popular cultures, which are the bottom line of intangible cultural heritage in Brazil, as part of national heritage, dates from the late 1970s, when the National Center for Cultural Reference was created within IFAN's parameter structure. That institution's concern was to identify, make inventories, and produce documentation about popular know-how, materials, and aesthetic motives, so as to contribute to the development of a Brazilian design, an aesthetic language and technology that would be recognizable in the international scene. The experience was aborted within few years, but left an important legacy to the formation of heritage, to the formation of the heritage field in the country, which is the idea of heritage as cultural reference, inscribed in the Brazilian Constitution of 1988. In the 1980s, the growing mobilization against almost 20 years of military regime contributed to a significant growth and to the empowerment of social movements for civil rights, housing, urban planning, as well as against censorship in the country. Preservation agencies at all administrative levels faced then an important increase of demands regarding the protection of popular arts and crafts, particularly those developed by African descendants and indigenous peoples. The immigrant's heritage has always been a problem for Brazilian preservation institutions. two issues were at stake in the 80s. Full access of popular classes to citizenship rights, and a critical outlook towards the idea of national culture as symbolic, and of the symbolic representations about Brazil as a nation. Safeguarding intangible cultural heritage as a federal public policy emerges from this context, having as a landmark the already mentioned 1988 Federal Constitution that defines Brazilian cultural patrimony as constituted by goods of material and immaterial nature that bear reference to the identity, action, and memory of the various groups that form Brazilian society. This definition is innovative in several important senses. First, it includes both material and immaterial cultural goods as elements of the country's heritage, opening the way to a much broader approach to heritage than had been practiced up to that date. Second, the idea of heritage is no more exclusively associated with academically defined exceptionality, but with the notion of reference in relation to realities such as social identity and social memory. Heritage becomes an expression of social cultural diversity and not of hegemonic elite culture and history. Federal Decree 3551, which entered into force in the year 2000, is the specific legal instrument for safeguarding immaterial heritage in the country at federal level. So you see, it was published and entered into force before the ICH Convention. And this is one of the reasons why Brazil was such a, had such a visible, perhaps, presence in drafting the convention. More recently, several states and municipalities, provincia e regione, have also created their own safeguarding instruments, as is happening now here in Italy and in other countries. That decree enforces the administrative process of inventory making and registration, and creates the National Program for Immaterial Heritage, through which, since 2005, an annual budget is specifically assigned to this public policy in the Culture Ministry budget. The conceptual framework adopted by the Brazilian Constitution, as well as by the just mentioned decree, has important implications for policy making. It implies that, first, heritage is a living reality, thus belonging to present time, not to the past. Second, it primarily refers to real and specific human collectivities, not to nation as an abstraction. So it was not surprising that social movements, particularly those rooted in the struggle for cultural rights of indigenous, African, Brazilian, and traditional peoples, have stepped forward to discuss whose cultural references would be inventoried, identified, and protected. It's also relevant to highlight the tacit understanding that has emerged from this process, according to which the continuity of heritage would not be the simple handling of tradition from generation to generation, but the active result of transactions between heritage holders and external political entities. Preservation becomes thus a political and legal issue, a matter of citizenship rights. This is roughly the background from which Brazil as a country and Brazilians, such as me, have participated in the elaboration and implementation of UNESCO's 2003 Convention since the late 1990s. The I.C.H. Convention offers an innovative approach to heritage, which gradually illuminates the cultural geography of our times. It's a very significant fact that it has been promptly supported by developing and emergent countries like India and Brazil, as well as by others that, regardless of the fact of being developed or not, did not have the visibility and were not as influential in cultural preservation matters as most Western European countries. And it's also very significant that through the same process, an ethnicized Europe presently emerges from the fissures of a territory that has been so deeply marked by the monumental masterpieces of outstanding universal value, praised by the 2072 World Heritage Convention. The I.C.H. Convention not only highlights diversity and some insurgent cultural configurations within or across international boundaries, but also has the peculiarity of aiming at living social practices, consequently at dynamic realities. Furthermore, it was conceived as is being implemented as a socially committed and politically inclusive tool of cultural policy, since first, it is flexible enough to cover a wide variety of manifestations of cultural difference, and consequently, the myriad circumstances of their reproduction around the globe. Second, its implementation is highly dependent on so-called cultural or heritage communities. This is the holders of the social practices that it aims at safeguarding. Indeed, the objects of this convention are not inert realities, but in fact subjects, agents, that is, people engaged in collective action. Consequently, its implementation can produce, by definition, reflexive inputs both ways. Decisions taken by the convention's organs trigger responses from stakeholders, and these, in their turn, feed back the decisions concerning its implementation. The nature of this convention's object, that of being living social realities, and the open-minded intellectual environment in which it has been drafted, gave way to the dialogic character of this legal instrument. First, I.C.H. is what heritage bearers assume as being their patrimony. Second, the cultural community's free, prior, and informed consent, as well as their active participation, are prerequisites for most, if not all, safeguarding actions. However, at the same time, its implementation depends on whether or not the differential value, this heritage value, ascribed by cultural communities to their own practices, gets an official recognition as is inscribed in one of the convention's lists, the urgent safeguarding list or the representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. The text approved by UNESCO's General Assembly in 2003 was ratified to this date by 148 countries. This means that its premises were endorsed, legitimized, and produced practical consequences in a large number of countries, affecting many cultural communities. The dialogic, socially committed, and inclusive character of the 2003 Convention has probably motivated the adherence of many cultural communities, NGOs, and social activists, to whom this can become a helpful tool for strengthening the respect for cultural diversity, the promotion of human creativity, and for the improvement of quality of life and political inclusion in times of crisis in the world system. So to conclude, a consistent experience has been accumulated along these 10 years of hard work towards the implementation of the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. But now it seems necessary to move forward and rethink some of its basic working parameters, taking on board the realities and challenges that have been raised by its real-life stakeholders. In this future development, a most relevant challenge to be faced by the ICH community at large is the safeguarding of what seems to be the three pillars of the ICH Convention: dialogism, social commitment, and inclusiveness, against the seduction, risks, and threats of bureaucratic rigidity and formalism. These are important constitutive ingredients of the intangible legacy produced by the first decade of the ICH Convention. Thank you for your attention.